Mark had never been the type to back down from a fight. In fact, he often found himself drawn to confrontations, especially when it came to making sure people knew their place. He was a cop in a city that was struggling with its own demons: crime, corruption, and deep-rooted racial tension. But for Mark, the most obvious of these tensions was always with people who didn't look like him. His upbringing, molded by a father who held tight to the beliefs of an older, outdated world, had taught him that certain people were simply less than. He wasn't proud of it, but he couldn't deny that those beliefs had stayed with him through the years. This particular afternoon was no different. Mark's patrol car was parked along the side of a quiet street, the sun hanging low in the sky, casting long shadows over the cracked pavement. He was waiting for something, anything, maybe another stop for a broken taillight or an odd encounter. His thoughts were interrupted by a call from dispatch. There had been an altercation nearby, and he was needed to respond. When he arrived at the scene, things were already heated. Two individuals, an older man and a woman, were arguing loudly on the sidewalk. The man was visibly drunk, swaying side to side, shouting obscenities at the woman. She was holding her ground, her voice steady despite the man's drunken aggression. Mark stepped out of the car, his boots hitting the pavement with a heavy thud. His hand instinctively rested on the grip of his gun, not that he intended to use it, but it gave him a sense of control. His eyes scanned the scene, his mind already judging the situation before he'd even spoken a word. The woman was tall, with sharp features and dark skin, a no-nonsense demeanor that immediately rubbed him the wrong way. He couldn't quite put his finger on it, but something about her seemed too composed for someone in a crisis. "Hey!" Mark shouted, his voice cutting through the air like a whip. "Step away from her." The man turned, his bloodshot eyes narrowing at the sight of the officer. The woman, however, didn't budge. She stood her ground, staring directly at Mark, unwavering. "Officer, I don't need your help," she said calmly, her tone firm but not hostile. "This situation is under control," Mark smirked. "Under control? Looks to me like you're about to get yourself hurt. Maybe you should let someone who knows what they're doing handle this." The woman's eyes flickered just for a moment, but it was enough for Mark to catch it, a flicker of something dangerous, something he didn't like. "Listen, I've got this," she repeated, her voice low but commanding. "Step aside." Mark could feel the tension building. He wasn't used to being challenged like this, not by someone like her. It didn't help that she had an air of authority about her, like she was used to being the one in charge. His patience was thinning, and his temper, one that he had spent years trying to keep in check, was beginning to rise. The woman took a step forward, probably to assert her control over the situation, but it was the wrong move in Mark's eyes. He'd had enough. Before he could think twice, he reached out, his hand catching her shoulder and shoving her back. She stumbled slightly, but steadied herself with surprising grace. And then, without warning, he swung. The punch connected with her jaw, a sharp crack cutting through the air, followed by the sickening thud of flesh meeting force. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. Mark's heart pounded in his chest as the woman staggered back, her hand instinctively going to her face. His mind raced, a flood of adrenaline and confusion filling his senses. What had he just done? Why did he lose control like that? But then, something changed. The woman looked up, her face a mask of calm, though her eyes were wide with shock. She didn't react with anger or even pain. No, she simply stared at him. And in that moment, Mark realized something he hadn't expected. Her uniform wasn't just any uniform. It was a badge, gleaming in the sunlight. A badge he recognized. She was the police chief, Olivia Hayes. The punch hung in the air, its impact still reverberating in Mark's chest as the weight of the moment hit him. His mind went blank. The woman, no, the chief, hadn't fallen to the ground. She wasn't writhing in pain. She wasn't shouting for backup. She simply stood there, her gaze locking with his, as if waiting for him to realize what he had just done. "Do you have any idea who I am?" Olivia's voice was steady, but there was an unmistakable edge to it now. Mark opened his mouth, but no words came out. His throat was dry, his stomach twisted into knots. He'd just punched his boss, the chief of police. The silence between them stretched out thick and suffocating. Then slowly Mark's knees buckled and he dropped to the ground before her. His body trembled, not just from the shock of what he'd done, but from the realization that this moment was about to change everything. "Ma'am, His voice cracked, but he didn't know what else to say. Olivia stood there, her expression unreadable. For a second Mark thought she might yell, might arrest him on the spot, but instead she simply sighed, her eyes narrowing with an emotion Mark couldn't quite place. And then, as if the weight of everything had finally hit her too, she took a deep breath, her voice softening but not with sympathy, more with a strange kind of understanding. "So you've made a mistake," she said. "But this isn't over, Mark, not by a long shot." The words hung in the air as Mark knelt in front of her, his heart racing, his world unraveling. This was just the beginning. Hit subscribe and leave a comment. With where you're watching from, this story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? Mark had never really considered the people he judged, or rather the people he believed he understood. He didn't grow up in a neighborhood that encouraged diversity, far from it. Raised in the suburbs, his world had been a monochromatic one, where people like him were always in control. His father, a man of strict principles, had taught him that the world was divided into groups, those who worked hard and those who didn't, those who were worthy and those who were not. His father had always spoken about the other people, the ones who didn't look like them, who didn't live like them, and Mark had absorbed it all like a sponge. From a young age, Mark had been taught that loyalty to his people was paramount. The others were strangers, sometimes even threats and nothing more. This wasn't just about race, it was about class, culture, and geography. The world outside of his white working-class neighborhood was a place of uncertainty. That mindset had shaped Mark into the officer he was today. Confident, maybe even arrogant, and above all, certain that he was in the right, especially when it came to policing people who didn't look like him. His career had followed a predictable path. Straight out of the police academy, Mark had joined the department with an eager resolve, ready to make a name for himself. It wasn't long before he started moving up the ranks, earning respect among his peers, or at least the ones who thought like him. He'd prided himself on his ability to keep his head cool, to make snap decisions under pressure, but his opinions about certain people, those had never wavered. But then Olivia had come into the picture. She hadn't been an immediate threat. In fact, Mark had been somewhat impressed when he'd first met Olivia Hayes. She was a woman in a male-dominated field, and she carried herself with a quiet authority that Mark had come to respect, even if he didn't fully understand it. It wasn't until her promotion to police chief that things started to get uncomfortable. Olivia had risen quickly through the ranks, but not by playing the same game the men did. She wasn't interested in slapping backs and making deals. She worked hard, no shortcuts, but more than that, she was fair. Sometimes it seemed even too fair. She always spoke about diversity and inclusion, about making the department more reflective of the community it served. And those ideas to Mark were foreign, threatening even. He'd never told anyone, but deep down Mark had resented Olivia. She was a constant reminder that things were changing, that the world he understood was being pulled out from under him. There had been whispers in the locker rooms, casual conversations where others shared his opinions, but no one ever dared speak them out loud, except Mark. "She doesn't know how to run this department," Mark would mutter to his fellow officers when the topic of Olivia's leadership came up. "She's too soft, too progressive." In those moments, he'd felt a bond with the others who shared his views. He wasn't alone in his discomfort. Olivia had always been a professional, but as her authority grew, Mark felt her presence looming over him, testing his own beliefs and sense of power. He had never once questioned his place, never once thought that someone like her, a woman of color, could wield so much control. Until that day. The day he punched her. As he sat in his car later that evening, reflecting on the situation, Mark couldn't help but replay the moment over and over in his mind. He'd been so certain of himself, so sure that he was right, but when he saw the badge on her chest, the badge he had seen countless times before, only now it meant something entirely different. Everything changed. It wasn't just that he had hit a woman. He had hit the police chief, the highest authority in the department. It was the ultimate mistake. But the bigger question gnawed at him. Why had he done it? Had he been so blinded by his own prejudices that he didn't even think for a second about the woman in front of him? The woman who had worked harder than anyone to get to the position she was in? The woman who had proven herself time and time again to be a capable leader, someone who commanded respect, deserved respect? Mark felt the weight of the reality settle on his shoulders. He had crossed a line, one that could never be uncrossed. Meanwhile, Olivia sat in her office, the silence of the room pressing in on her as she stared at the reports in front of her. Her mind wasn't on the papers, though. It was on the incident with Mark. She'd known for some time that there was tension in the department, but she hadn't expected it to escalate like this. Not like that. Olivia had worked so hard to earn her position. She had clawed her way up, facing challenges from every angle. There had been whispers, subtle insults, but she had always kept her head down, focused on her job. She had never let it get to her. She couldn't afford to. But today was different. Mark's punch wasn't just a moment of physical aggression, it was a manifestation of something deeper. It wasn't just about race, although that played a part. It was about power, control, and respect. He had tried to assert dominance, but in doing so, he had proven his weakness. Olivia understood that the moment Mark had thrown that punch, he had exposed himself. She could have reacted differently. She could have fired him right there, thrown him into the streets, and that would have been the end of it. But something in her stopped her. Maybe it was the years of fighting to get where she was, fighting to prove she belonged. Maybe it was because she saw something in Mark, something beyond the anger, beyond the prejudice. She wasn't sure, but she knew one thing. She couldn't let this moment define him. Not yet. As Mark sat in his car, trying to piece together what had just happened, he couldn't shake the image of Olivia's eyes when she looked at him. The disappointment, the understanding, but there was something else there too, a challenge. "Do you have any idea who I am?" she had asked him. Mark didn't know the answer to that question yet, but one thing was for sure. Things were about to change. For him, for Olivia, for everyone. The world he thought he knew, it was shifting beneath him, and he was about to find out just how deep the cracks ran. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? The next few days were a blur for Mark. He'd been sent home immediately after the incident with Olivia. No paperwork, no immediate reprimand, just a chilling silence. From the department, it was like he was suspended in limbo. His phone rang once, but it was a friend, someone he trusted, who asked if he was okay. He had no answers. There were no updates, no one to turn to. He felt like a man adrift in an ocean of uncertainty. Mark sat on the edge of his couch, his mind replaying the scene over and over. It was like a movie reel that wouldn't stop. He saw Olivia standing there, steady and unflinching, after he'd hit her. He remembered the way her eyes had locked onto his, cold, calculating, and yet full of something he couldn't place. And then, of course, her words. "You've made a mistake. But this isn't over, Mark. Not by a long shot." Those words echoed in his head. She hadn't fired him right away. She hadn't even raised her voice. She'd just let the moment hang in the air between them. It had been a challenge that Mark didn't know how to face. He had always prided himself on knowing how things worked, knowing where he stood. But with Olivia, he was in uncharted territory. Meanwhile, Olivia had done exactly what Mark hadn't expected. She didn't go straight to internal affairs. She didn't file a report against him. Instead, she gave him the space to reflect, to feel the weight of his actions. It was a tactic that Mark hadn't anticipated, and one he hadn't understood. Until it was too late. That night, Olivia sat in her office, staring out of the window at the city below. She had thought about what had happened, about how she could have easily ended Mark's career with one swift move. But she couldn't bring herself to do it, not yet, not without first understanding what lay beneath his actions. She wasn't a naive person. She knew that Mark's anger, his aggression, was rooted in something much deeper than the incident on the sidewalk. She could feel it. It wasn't just about him hitting her. It was about everything he'd held inside for years, the bitterness, the resentment, the belief that the world was divided into us and them. And for the first time, Olivia wondered if maybe Mark wasn't just some lost cause. If there was a way to help him see beyond his own narrow view of the world, the department had its flaws, and Mark was just one of many officers who had grown up with those same biases. The system itself was broken in many ways. Olivia knew that dismantling it wouldn't happen overnight. She couldn't fix the years of institutionalized discrimination and prejudice with a single decision. But she could start with one person. She could start with Mark. The next morning, Olivia called him into her office. She had a meeting planned with the rest of the command staff, but she needed to speak with him first. She wasn't sure what she expected to come from the conversation, but she knew it was a necessary step. Mark arrived early, his uniform pressed and his posture stiff. He had no idea what to expect, but the look on Olivia's face when he entered. The room told him everything. She wasn't angry, she wasn't upset, she was calm, too calm. "Mark, sit down," Olivia said, motioning to the chair across from her desk. Mark hesitated, then sat, his body tense. He still hadn't figured out why he wasn't immediately fired. He should have been. The department couldn't afford to let that kind of behavior slide. Yet here he was, waiting for some kind of consequence to fall down on him. "I don't know what you expect me to say," Mark finally broke the silence. "I made a mistake. I hit. You and I shouldn't have." Olivia nodded, but her gaze never wavered. "Yes, you did, and that was wrong. But it's not the only thing that happened that day, Mark. You've been a cop for a long time. You know what we're up against in this city, but you also know how much it's changed. How much we as a department have to change." Mark shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "I don't need a lecture, Olivia." "I'm not lecturing you, Mark. I'm asking you to think about what happened, about why it happened, because I know that hitting me wasn't just about that moment. It was about everything you've been carrying with you, the way you see the world, the way you think about people who don't look like you, who don't think like you, and that's where we need to start." Mark clenched his fists, feeling the anger rise again, but this time it wasn't aimed at her. It was at himself. "You don't get it," he muttered. "You don't know what it's like out there. You've never been out there in the streets, dealing with the things we have to deal with. You don't know what it's like to get pushed around by people who don't respect the badge. I've seen things, Olivia. Things that will mess with your head." Olivia's expression softened. "You're right, Mark. I don't know what it's like, but I do know that the way you see people and the way you react to them has consequences. Not just for you, but for the community, for the department. You're not just fighting crime, Mark, you're fighting your own demons." Mark was silent for a moment, the weight of her words settling into his chest. He wanted to argue, to defend himself, but something inside him held him back. Olivia was right. Everything she said was right. And the truth was, he didn't know how to fix it. He had always thought he was doing the right thing, that he was above it all, but now he realized how wrong he had been. "Mark," Olivia continued, her voice low, "I'm giving you a chance, not just for the sake of the department, but for you, because I believe you can change, but it has to come from you. No one can force you to be better. You have to want it." Mark's head hung low. He couldn't look her in the eye anymore. How could he? He wasn't sure if he was capable of change, but he knew one thing. Whatever path he took next, it had to be different from the one that had led him here. I don't know if I can do this," he admitted quietly. Olivia leaned forward, her voice gentle but firm. "You don't have to know everything right now, but I'm asking you to try. Try to see the world differently. Try to see people differently. And most importantly, try to see yourself differently." Mark nodded slowly, a mixture of guilt and uncertainty clouding his mind. He wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time he felt like maybe there was a way forward. It wasn't going to be easy. Nothing worth having ever was, but it was a start. Mark had always been a man who thrived on certainty, on having control over the situations he found himself in. He hated uncertainty. He hated not knowing what came next. But now, in the wake of the conversation with Olivia, he was left in a state of constant questioning, unable to shake the doubts that had settled in his mind. He spent the next few days stewing in his own thoughts, his usual routine of patrols and paperwork feeling strangely hollow. Every call he responded to, every face he passed on the street, seemed to trigger the same internal dialogue. What if Olivia was right? What if he was more part of the problem than he had ever realized? There were moments when he tried to push the thoughts away, focusing on the immediate task at hand, but then the truth would creep back in, and he'd find himself thinking about everything he had done, everything he had believed. The realization hit him with a suffocating force. He was scared. Scared of being wrong, scared of losing his sense of self, scared of admitting that everything he had been taught about the world, everything he had believed, was a lie. Meanwhile, Olivia continued her work, but the incident with Mark lingered in her thoughts as well. She had been in this job long enough to know that the real work wasn't about arrests or convictions. It was about changing hearts and minds. And Mark? He wasn't just some rogue cop with a chip on his shoulder. He was a man who had been shaped by years of conditioning, by the system that had never questioned him. And now he was questioning himself. It had been a risk to offer him that second chance. Olivia had learned the hard way that people didn't change overnight. But there was something about Mark, something buried beneath the layers of pride and stubbornness that made her believe he could turn things around. It wouldn't be easy, but maybe, just maybe, he could be the one to prove that change was possible, even for someone as set in their ways as him. 2 weeks after the incident, Mark found himself sitting at a table in a local community center. It was a Saturday morning, and he had been reluctantly signed up for a mandatory diversity and sensitivity training session. The department had organized it, and Olivia had insisted that he attend. He'd resisted at first, but there was no avoiding it. He knew if he didn't show up, it would only make things worse. So here he was, surrounded by people he didn't know, people who didn't look like him, people who probably didn't want him there. He couldn't help but feel like an outsider, even though he had been a cop for years. He had seen the faces of the people in this room before, on the streets, in the neighborhoods he patrolled. But this was different. There were no sirens blaring in the background, no criminals to chase, no threats to face. There was only a circle of strangers, all looking at him expectantly, as though they knew something he didn't. The facilitator, a middle-aged black man with a calm demeanor, stepped forward and smiled warmly at the group. "I know most of you are here because you've been told you have to be. But let me tell you something. This work is about more than just checking a box. This is about understanding the people you serve, the people who live in your city. It's about seeing them as human beings, not just suspects or victims." Mark felt a tightness in his chest. The words hit a little too close to home. He had always seen people as cases, profiles, categories. He had never seen them as individuals with stories of their own. This was the first time someone was challenging him to think differently, to understand a perspective he had never considered before. "You might not agree with everything I say today," the facilitator continued, "but I want you to ask yourself one question. What is it that drives you? Why did you become a cop in the first place?" Mark clenched his fists. He hadn't thought about that question in years. Why had he become a cop? Was it to uphold the law? Was it because he wanted to make a difference? Or was it because it gave him power, control over a world that felt unpredictable and out of his hands? He wasn't sure anymore. The session dragged on, and Mark found himself listening more than he ever had before. The facilitator spoke about implicit bias, about how everyone, even the most well-meaning people, carried prejudices that were often ingrained by the society they lived in. The room was filled with uncomfortable silence as officers, many of whom were as resistant as Mark, sat in their seats, squirming under the weight of the conversation. It wasn't until later that afternoon that Mark's breakthrough moment came. During a break, Mark found himself standing by the coffee table, avoiding eye contact with the others. He was trying to gather his thoughts, trying to make sense of everything that had been said. That's when a young woman approached him. She was tall, with dark skin and a bright smile, and she was one of the officers who had been in the session. With him. "Hey," she said, extending her hand. "I don't know if we've ever met. I'm Angela." Mark hesitated for a moment, then shook her hand. "Mark, I know this might feel weird," Angela said, "but I've been where you are. I used to think the way you do. I thought everything I knew about this job, about people, was the truth. But then one day I had to face the fact that I was wrong, and that's hard, you know?" Mark looked at her, his brow furrowed. "How did you deal with it? I mean, if everything I thought was wrong, what do I do now?" Angela shrugged. "You don't have to have it all figured out, Mark. Nobody does. But you start by listening. Really, listening. And being honest with yourself about who you are, what you believe, and why you believe it. It's tough, but it's worth it." For the first time in a long time, Mark felt a flicker of hope. Maybe Angela was right. Maybe he didn't have to have all the answers right now. But he could try. He could make an effort to see things differently. To stop reacting out of anger or fear. To start listening to the people around him, not just as suspects or criminals, but as human beings. The next week, Mark found himself back in Olivia's office. This time he wasn't there to apologize or make excuses. He was there to ask for help. "I don't know where to start," he said, his voice low. Olivia looked at him, her expression softening. "Start by being honest with yourself, Mark. Start by acknowledging the things you've been too afraid to face." Mark nodded slowly. For the first time, he felt like he wasn't alone in this struggle. He wasn't sure where the journey would take him, but he was ready to take the first step. Mark's life had been defined by rules and regulations. He'd lived by the book, checked every box, and followed the prescribed paths. But lately, the very rules he had lived by had started to feel like chains. Each time he thought he understood how the world worked, another conversation, another encounter, showed him how little he really knew. That evening, he sat at his kitchen table, a cup of coffee growing cold in front of him. His mind wandered, back to his conversation with Angela, the officer at the training session. Her words echoed in his mind. "You don't have to have it all figured out, Mark. Nobody does. But you start by listening. Mark had always thought that being a good cop meant acting first and asking questions later. It was part of his training, part of the badge. But Angela's words had planted a seed of doubt. Maybe there was more to it than that. The next day, Olivia asked him to meet her at the precinct after his shift. He didn't know what to expect. The last time they'd spoken, there had been a tension in the air, a sense of anticipation that was now replaced by something else, something unfamiliar. When Mark arrived, Olivia was already there, seated at her desk. She looked up, her expression calm but serious. She motioned for him to sit. "Mark, we need to talk." "About what?" he asked, his voice rough from a sleepless night. His mind raced, but he was too tired to make sense of anything. Olivia leaned forward, folding her hands on the desk. "About you, about the work you're doing to change. I've been keeping an eye on you, and I want to know what you've been thinking since the training session." Mark shifted in his seat. "Honestly, I don't know. I'm trying to figure it out, Olivia. Everything feels different now. I thought I understood things, but now it's like I've been walking around blindfolded." Olivia nodded. "I know, it's not easy. Change never is. But the fact that you're questioning things, that's the first step. And you need to keep questioning, Mark. If you stop asking yourself the hard questions, then you stop growing." Mark ran a hand through his hair, frustration creeping into his voice. "I don't even know where to start. I don't know how to fix it. All these years of seeing people a certain way, of being part of the problem, how do I undo that?" Olivia's eyes softened. "You don't undo it overnight. You take it one step at a time. You listen. You engage with people you've never thought to engage with before. You start to see things through their eyes, and you keep doing the work every single day." Mark looked down at the floor, the weight of his own guilt pressing heavily on his chest. "It feels impossible. Every time I think I'm getting it, something happens that makes me question everything." Olivia stood up and walked over to the window, looking out at the city below. "That's what happens when you start to challenge everything you've ever known. You start to feel uncomfortable. You start to feel like you're losing control. But that discomfort, that's growth." There was a long pause, and Mark watched her, searching for something to hold on to. He had always admired her strength, the way she could face difficult situations without flinching. But now, in this moment, he realized that Olivia too was trying to figure things out. She wasn't just his boss. She was someone who had to make difficult choices every day, choices that affected more than just her career. She was trying to lead a department full of people who had their own biases, their own struggles, and she had no clear path forward either. "I'm not sure I can do it," Mark said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. Olivia turned back to face him. "I didn't say it would be easy, but I believe you can do it. You've got something inside of you, Mark, that you haven't even begun to tap into. You've been carrying around all this anger, this bitterness. But if you can let go of that, if you can really open yourself up to seeing things differently, you could be an incredible cop." Mark shook his head. "I've always thought I was doing the right thing. I was just protecting people, keeping order, doing my job. But now I'm starting to think, maybe I've been part of the problem all along." Olivia stepped closer, her tone softer but still firm. "You were part of a system that wasn't designed to help everyone, but that doesn't mean you're beyond redemption. It doesn't mean that you can't change. You're not alone in this, Mark. I'm here to help you. The department is here to help you, but you've got to do the hard work." Mark stared at her, feeling the weight of her words settle into his bones. It wasn't going to be easy, he knew that, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like maybe, just maybe, there was a way out. He wasn't sure how long it would take, or if he could ever truly undo the damage he'd done, but he was willing to try. "I want to try," he said, the words coming out more quietly than he intended. "I want to change. I don't want to be that guy anymore." Olivia gave him a small nod. "Good, because change starts with you." As Mark left the precinct that night, the air felt different. It wasn't just the cool breeze or the faint hum of the city around him. It was something deeper, something in the way he saw the world now. For the first time he could see the cracks in the foundation, and maybe, just maybe, he could begin to rebuild it. He didn't have all the answers. He didn't even know what the next day would bring. But he knew this. He was no longer the same person who had punched Olivia that day. He was someone different now, someone who could make a choice. And that choice? It was the first real choice he had made in years. He wasn't sure where this journey would take him, but he was ready to find out. Mark had always believed that being a cop meant making split-second decisions, trusting his instincts to guide him through the chaos. But now, as he tried to navigate the emotional landscape of change, he found that his instincts weren't as reliable as they used to be. They had been shaped by years of conditioning, years of seeing the world in black and white. Now he was being forced to question everything. His first test came sooner than expected. It was a warm Tuesday afternoon when he got the call. A domestic disturbance in a run-down apartment complex. The kind of call he used to handle with ease. He had been on the force long enough to know the signs of trouble before he even arrived at the scene. But this time, as he drove toward the location, a sense of unease settled over him. He had been doing a lot of thinking in the past few weeks, reflecting on the biases that had guided his actions. But the world of policing didn't wait for you to catch up with your thoughts. It was a world that demanded immediate responses, snap decisions, and Mark wasn't sure he was ready for that. When he arrived at the apartment complex, the scene was chaotic. A woman stood in front of the door, visibly shaken, holding her young child close to her chest. Her eyes were wide with fear, and she looked at Mark with a mixture of hope and suspicion. "Officer," she said, her voice trembling. "He's inside. He's got a gun. Please, you've got to do something." Mark's hand instinctively went to his holster, but as he stood there, he realized something. He didn't want to just rush in. He didn't want to make the same mistakes he had made so many times before. He could feel the weight of the badge on his chest, but it didn't feel like a symbol of power anymore. It felt like a responsibility to do the right thing, not just to uphold the law, but to protect the people who lived in his community. He glanced at the woman, her eyes pleading with him. The child in her arms was quiet, too. Quiet. Mark swallowed hard. His years of experience told him to act quickly, to handle this like he had handled so many situations before. But something in his gut told him to slow down. He stepped closer to the woman, trying to keep his voice. "Calm. Is he threatening you? Are there other people in the apartment?" The woman nodded frantically. "He's been drinking. He's always violent when he drinks. Please, officer, don't just stand there." Mark took a deep breath. This was his moment. He could feel the urge to rush in, to act fast, but he knew that wasn't the solution. He had seen too many situations spiral out of control because of hasty decisions. He didn't want to be part of that anymore. "Stay back," he said, motioning to the woman and her child. "I'm going to try and talk to him first. You don't need to worry. We're going to handle this the right way." He made his way to the door and knocked gently, his heart pounding in his chest. The last time he had done something like this, he had been a different person. He had been driven by fear, by a desire to assert control. Now he was trying to approach the situation with patience, with understanding. After a few moments, the door creaked open, revealing a man who looked to be in his mid-30s. His eyes were bloodshot, his posture unsteady. He held a bottle of liquor in one hand and a handgun in the other. Mark's heart skipped a beat, but he kept his voice steady. "Hey, listen, I'm not here to fight," Mark said, his tone measured but firm. "I just want to make sure everyone is safe. Put the gun down. You don't need to do this." The man's eyes darted between Mark and the door, where the woman was still standing, her back pressed against the wall. Mark could see the anger and confusion in the man's eyes. He wasn't just a criminal. He was a person who had been pushed to the edge, a person who didn't know how to handle his emotions anymore. "Stay back, cop!" the man shouted, waving the gun toward Mark. For a moment, Mark felt a rush of adrenaline. He knew the drill. He knew what to do in this situation. He had been trained for this, but instead of reacting with force, instead of drawing his weapon, he took a step back. He lowered his hands, showing the man that he wasn't a threat. "I'm not going to hurt you," Mark said quietly, trying to keep the fear out of his voice. "But you've got to put the gun down. You've got a family out there. You don't want to hurt anyone." The man's grip on the gun tightened. Mark could see the inner conflict in his eyes, the desperation. It was a standoff, but Mark didn't flinch. He knew that if he could get through to this man, if he could show him that there was another way, then this wouldn't have to end in violence. "I'm here to help you," Mark continued, his voice calm but firm. "Just put the gun down and we'll talk. Nobody needs to get hurt." The man wavered, his eyes flickering with doubt, and then, in a moment that felt like an eternity, the gun dropped from his hand and clattered to the floor. Mark exhaled in relief, his body still tense but his mind racing with the gravity of what had just happened. After the man was arrested and taken into custody, Mark stood outside the apartment building, his hands trembling slightly. He couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted in him, something that had been there all along, but had been buried under the weight of his biases. He had made a choice today, a different kind of choice. Instead of following his old instincts, his old patterns, he had chosen to listen, to take a step back, to try to understand. And it had worked. The situation hadn't escalated. No one had been hurt, but it wasn't just the outcome that mattered. It was the way he had approached it. For the first time, he had seen the situation through a different lens, not as a cop trying to assert control, but as a human being trying to help another human being. As he drove back to the precinct, Mark thought about Olivia's words again. "You start by listening. You engage with people you've never thought to engage with before. You start to see things through their eyes." He wasn't there yet. He knew that. But today, he had taken the first step. And for the first time, that step didn't feel like a burden. It felt like freedom. It had been a week since Mark's confrontation with the man in the apartment, and although he had made progress, he could feel himself faltering. Every day presented a new challenge, a new test. He knew that change wasn't linear, but sometimes it felt like he was walking a tightrope, unsure of whether he was making strides or slipping backward. He arrived at the precinct early one morning, the familiar hum of fluorescent lights overhead and the constant buzz of radio chatter grounding him in his old routine. But today something felt different. Today he wasn't the same cop who had walked through those doors a few weeks ago. The badge on his chest still gleamed, but it no longer felt like a shield. It felt like a symbol of responsibility, a responsibility he hadn't fully understood until recently. As Mark walked through the hallway toward the locker room, He noticed a few of the other officers giving him a side glance. Their eyes lingered just a little too long, as if they were weighing him, judging him. He had been one of them, the guy who followed the rules, who didn't question authority, who put the badge above everything else. Now he was the guy who had started to change, and change made people uncomfortable. He pushed open the door to the locker room and paused. Olivia was sitting on the bench, her uniform neatly pressed, her eyes focused on something in her hands. As he walked in, she looked up, offering him a small nod of acknowledgement. "Morning, Mark," she said. Her tone was calm, but not without a hint of concern, as if she could sense the unrest swirling inside him. "Morning," Mark replied, his voice tight. He wasn't sure what to say. There was so much he wanted to unload, so much he didn't understand, but he wasn't sure if he was ready to confront all of it. Olivia didn't push him. Instead, she sat down what she had been holding, a file folder, and looked at him directly. "How's it been going?" she asked, her voice soft but insistent. "The work, the change." Mark hesitated, running a hand through his hair. "It's tough. Some days it feels like I'm making progress, like I'm seeing things differently. But other days I feel like I'm slipping back into my old habits. It's frustrating." Olivia nodded, her eyes understanding. "Change is always like that. It's not something that happens overnight. And it doesn't happen on your timetable. You've spent years conditioning yourself to respond a certain way, and now you're asking yourself to do the opposite. It's hard, but it's worth it." Mark swallowed, his throat dry. "I keep thinking about what I did in that apartment. I acted differently. I didn't follow the old script, and it worked. But then I wonder if I can keep doing it. What if I can't? What if this is all just some idealistic fantasy and I can't really change who I am?" Olivia's gaze softened, and she stood up, walking over to him. "Mark, what you did in that apartment was real. It was messy and complicated, but it was real. You stepped out of the mold you had been in for years, and that's not easy. It's not supposed to be easy." He looked at her, searching her eyes for something, some sign that she had all the answers. But Olivia wasn't offering any quick fixes. Instead, she gave him a quiet smile and placed a hand on his shoulder. "You're not going to have all the answers today," she said. "But the fact that you're asking the questions is what matters. The fact that you're questioning yourself, your role, your place in this system, that's the first step toward real change. And it's going to take time. You've got to give yourself the space to fail and learn. That's the only way forward." Marx nodded slowly, absorbing her words. He knew she was right, but it didn't make the journey any easier. Every part of him wanted to have it all figured out, to be the cop who had all the answers. But Olivia was asking him to do something he had never done before, to embrace uncertainty. Before he could respond, the door to the locker room swung open, and one of the other officers, a tall man named Jake, stepped in. He looked at Mark and then at Olivia, his expression unreadable. "Hey, Mark," Jake said, his voice low. "Got a minute?" Mark raised an eyebrow. "For what?" Jake shifted on his feet, his gaze flickering between Mark and Olivia. "I need to talk to you about something in private." Mark exchanged a glance with Olivia, who gave him a brief nod before turning back to her desk. Mark followed Jake out into the hallway, wondering what this was about. Jake wasn't someone who typically initiated personal conversations. The tension in the air was palpable. When they reached a quiet corner of the precinct, Jake turned to Mark, his face serious. "Look, I don't know how to say this, but I've been hearing things. People are talking about you." Mark frowned. "What do you mean, talking?" Jake lowered his voice. "About you changing, about the way you've been acting lately. People are questioning you, Mark. They're not sure what's going on with you. Some of them think you're weak. Some of them think you're trying to be some kind of hero." Mark felt his stomach drop. He had suspected that something like this was happening, but hearing it out loud made it feel real. "Are you one of them?" Mark asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Jake hesitated, his eyes darting to the side. "I don't know. I don't want to judge you, man. But it's hard. It's hard to watch someone change like this. People don't like change, especially in this line of work. They don't like seeing someone go from doing things the right way to questioning everything. It makes them uncomfortable. Mark's heart pounded in his chest. He had known that change would be difficult, but hearing the doubts from his colleagues, people he had worked with for years, stung in a way he hadn't expected. "I'm not trying to be a hero," Mark said, his voice firm. "I'm just trying to do the right thing. For once, I'm trying to be a better cop, a better person, and I know that's not going to be easy, but I'm not backing down." Jake nodded slowly, but his expression remained unreadable. "I get it. I do. But you need to be careful, Mark. There's a fine line between being a good cop and being a cop who doesn't know when to stop. You need to figure out where that line is before it's too late." Mark stood there for a moment, the weight of Jake's words sinking in. This was the reality of change. It wasn't just about his own internal struggle. It was about how those around him would react. And not everyone was going to support him. But as he walked back toward the locker room, he realized that he didn't need everyone's approval. What mattered was that he was willing to face the discomfort, the doubt, and the fear. Because if he didn't, then he would never be able to make a difference, not just for himself, but for the community he had sworn to protect. Mark had never considered himself a quitter. He had always prided himself on pushing through the hard days, fighting against whatever obstacles stood in his way. But as the days wore on, the weight of his new reality began to feel like a crushing burden. Every day, every shift, seemed to pile more onto his shoulders. His colleagues' doubt, his own confusion, and the growing sense of isolation all threatened to pull him under. He couldn't ignore the whispers anymore, the ones from his fellow officers when they thought he wasn't listening. The sideways glances, the judgment in their eyes, the way they spoke about him when they thought he was out of earshot. It all felt like a constant reminder that he was no longer part of the world he had known. He had crossed a line, and now he wasn't sure where he belonged. It didn't help that the precinct had become a battleground. The tension between Mark and the rest of the team was palpable. Every interaction felt strained, every task a reminder that he had somehow become an outsider. He couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted permanently, and he wasn't sure if it was just him or if the world around him had changed too. It all came to a head one afternoon. Mark had been called to a routine traffic stop in a neighborhood known for its high crime rates. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows over the cracked pavement, and Mark's nerves were on edge. He hadn't been in this area in weeks, not since his shift had changed, and he was more aware than ever of how much he stood out. Thud. Driver, a young black man no older than 20, was already standing outside his car when Mark approached. The man's hands were raised slightly, a gesture of caution. His eyes flickered nervously between Mark and the other officers who had arrived at the scene. "Is everything all right, officer?" the man asked, his voice tight. Mark was still trying to gather his thoughts when the man's words reached him. He could feel the tension rising between them, the palpable fear that this interaction might go sideways. He had been in situations like this countless times before, but today it felt different. Today he wasn't the cop who could intimidate and control. Today he was the cop who was trying to do better, to change, but wasn't sure if he even knew how. "Can I see your license and registration?" Mark asked, his voice rough, unsure. The man nodded and reached into his glove compartment to retrieve the documents. As he did, Mark caught sight of the other officers, Jake and another colleague, standing off to the side. Their eyes were on him, but there was no solidarity in their gaze. Mark could feel their judgment, like an invisible pressure pushing down on him. Jake stepped forward, clearly trying to assert dominance in the situation. "What's taking so long, Mark? Let's move this along," he said, his tone dismissive. "That die." Young man's hand froze, caught in the middle of retrieving his papers. His face shifted to one of pure anxiety. He glanced nervously between Mark and the other officers. "Is there a problem here?" the man asked, his voice now tinged with fear. Mark's heart sank. He could see the fear in the man's eyes, the recognition that things were escalating. And the worst part was, Mark wasn't sure how to stop it. He was still too caught in the middle of his internal conflict to react in the calm, measured way he wanted to. He was too aware of the presence of his colleagues, his former comrades, who were waiting for him to make a mistake. The tension in the air grew thicker. The young man was now visibly shaking, his hand hovering uncertainly in the air. "Jake?" Sensing Mark's hesitation, stepped even closer. "Come on, Mark, don't make this harder than it needs to be. Let's just finish this," Jake urged. Mark looked at the young man, then at Jake, feeling the weight of the situation shift. It was all too familiar. The scenario felt like one he had lived through 100 times. It wasn't supposed to be this difficult. Why couldn't he just do his job like he always had? He could hear the voices in his head, the voices of those who had trained him, the voices of his colleagues. They were all telling him to act, to take control, to follow the script, but everything in him screamed for a different path. He couldn't do it like this anymore. He couldn't just let things play out as they had in the past. The young man's nervous eyes met his, and in that moment Mark saw it. Fear. Not just the fear of a routine stop, but the fear that had been bred into him by years of systemic distrust. It wasn't just the young man's fear, it was his own. He had been part of creating this fear for so long, and now Mark could see how deep the divide ran, how much damage had been done. He took a step back, feeling a surge of frustration rise in his chest. This wasn't right. He wasn't right. He had been trained to see things in black and white, but now, standing in this moment, everything felt so complicated, so gray. "Jake," Mark said, his voice shaking, "step back. Let me handle this." Jake didn't say anything, but the look he gave Mark was enough. Disappointment, disdain. Mark could feel the weight of his colleague's gaze, but he didn't back down. This wasn't just about enforcing the law. This was about human connection. This was about understanding that no matter how hard the job was, the people involved still deserved respect. Mark turned back to the young man, who was still standing, frozen, his hands raised slightly in a defensive gesture. "Hey," Mark said softly, trying to steady his voice. "I know this looks bad. I don't want to make you feel threatened. I'm just doing my job, but I'm not here to hurt you. I'm just trying to get this sorted out." The young man's face softened, but the fear remained. Mark could tell he wasn't convinced, but at least for a moment he wasn't shaking quite as much. Mark knew this wasn't a magic fix, but it was a start. It was a crack in the wall, a small breakthrough in the way he had always operated. "Everything's good," Mark said finally, his words careful but firm. "Just a routine check. You can go now." The young man hesitated for a moment longer before nodding, slowly lowering his hands. "Thank you, officer," he said, his voice small but genuine. As Mark watched the man walk away, he felt a lump form in his throat. This wasn't the way he had expected things to play out. He had expected things to be simpler. He had expected to be able to just do his job without questioning every move he made. But as the young man disappeared down the street, Mark felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Peace. Jake stood next to him, his arms crossed, clearly displeased. "You're making this harder than it needs to be," Jake muttered, turning on his heel and walking away. But Mark didn't care. He wasn't sure where he was going from here. He wasn't sure if he could make it through the rest of his career as the cop he used to be. But for the first time in a long time, Mark didn't feel like he was failing. He felt like he was finally starting to understand what it meant to be a good cop, a good person. It was nearly midnight when Mark found himself driving through the quiet streets of the city. The radio on his dash turned low, the world outside cast in soft amber from flickering streetlights. His shift had ended hours ago, but the adrenaline wouldn't leave his system. His mind kept replaying the traffic stop, the young man's eyes, Jake's voice, his own voice. The city looked different at night, softer somehow, quieter, like it was holding its breath. Mark didn't even realize where he was going until he turned down the narrow street leading to Olivia's house. He had only been there once before, a cookout back when things were simpler, before everything had fractured and reformed, back when he didn't think twice about what side of the line he stood on. He parked in front of the small brick home, the porch light casting a gentle glow. For a second, he debated turning the car around and leaving. What was he even going to say? But the weight in his chest was too heavy to carry alone anymore. He stepped out of the car and walked slowly up the path. He didn't even have to knock. The door creaked open before he could raise a hand. Olivia stood there barefoot, in sweatpants and a faded t-shirt. Her hair was tied up messily, and her eyes were tired, but alert, as if she'd been expecting him. "You okay?" she asked quietly. He didn't answer. He didn't have to. She stepped aside, letting him in. They sat in silence for a few minutes on her couch, a half-empty glass of wine beside her, a muted TV flickering in the background. It was the kind of silence that only came between two people who had shared. Too many conversations to need words all the time. "I froze tonight," Mark said finally, staring down at his hands. "I didn't know what to do. Jake was pushing. The guy was scared out of his mind. And all I could think about was not becoming the headline I used to scroll past on my phone without a second thought." Olivia nodded slowly. "That's not freezing, Mark. That's growth. That's restraint. And it's rare," Mark scoffed. "It didn't feel like growth, it felt like panic. Like I was trapped between who I used to be and who I'm trying to become." "You are trapped," Olivia said softly. "But you're not stuck. There's a difference." He looked at her, his eyes bloodshot, his jaw clenched. "I'm losing them. Jake, the other guys. They don't trust me anymore. I used to be one of them, now I'm just this weird in-between. They think I'm soft, that I've forgotten what the job is about." "Have you?" she asked gently. Mark didn't answer. Not right away. He stared at the wall, where a photo of Olivia, with her family hung next to a bookshelf filled with crime thrillers and social justice memoirs. Everything in her life felt like a contradiction that somehow made sense. She didn't have to choose between being strong and being compassionate. She was both. "I used to think the job was about control," Mark said, voice low. "About order, but now I don't know. Maybe it's about care, about listening, about not making things worse." Olivia gave a faint smile. "You're getting there." There was another silence. Not heavy, not awkward, just thoughtful. "You know," she said after a while, "I used to think I had to work twice as hard just to be seen as equal, as a woman, as a black woman in uniform. But now, I realize, I have to work twice as hard just to keep believing this system can be better. That people like you can be better." Mark looked up at her, the words hitting deeper than he expected. "Do you still believe it?" he asked. "I believe in people who try," she said, "and who keep trying even when it costs them. That's what matters. You're in that space right now, where everything feels broken, but broken doesn't mean unfixable." He let out a breath, something in his chest loosening. He hadn't realized how tight it had been until it started to release. "I keep thinking about that night," he said after a pause. "When I hit you, the look on your face. I've never been able to shake it. I didn't see you that night. I didn't see anything, just a problem I wanted to control. And then you stood up, and suddenly it was like I'd been blind for years." Olivia looked down, her hands clasped loosely. "I wasn't angry that you hit me. Not really. I was angry that you didn't see me. That's what hurt the most." He swallowed hard. "I see you now." She nodded slowly, her voice barely a whisper. "Good. Now make sure you start seeing everyone else too." They sat there for a while longer, the tension between them giving way to a deeper understanding. Neither of them said it, but both knew. This was more than just an apology. It was a quiet agreement, a truce, maybe even the beginning of a partnership. Eventually, Olivia stood and walked to the kitchen. "You want coffee?" she asked over her shoulder. Mark cracked a tired smile. "Yeah, I think I'm going to need it." She laughed, soft and real. And for the first time in weeks, Mark felt like maybe he wasn't completely alone. The coffee had long gone cold. Mark sat alone in his apartment now, the mug still in his hands, untouched since he got home from Olivia's. The night had settled in, heavy and still, but his mind raced. He'd thought a lot on the drive home about what Olivia said, about being seen, and about choosing to keep trying even when the world around you doesn't seem to care. The reality was settling in with a quiet, persistent ache. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about the whole damn system. He pulled out the manila folder he'd stashed in his bag a week ago, a confidential internal report Olivia had given him after a long pause and a longer stare. "If you're serious about change," she'd said, Then you need to know what you're really up against. He opened it now, flipping through the pages. Names, incidents, complaints swept under the rug, body cam footage that never saw daylight, officers reassigned instead of reprimanded, a culture of silence dressed up in procedural language. Mark had known the department had issues, he wasn't blind. But this was a rot buried so deep you had to wonder if anything could grow out of it again. One case caught his eye. Officer Stephen Delaney. Excessive force. Suspect ended up in the hospital. Internal Affairs had recommended suspension, but it was overturned by someone higher up. Lack of sufficient evidence, the report said. But attached was a photo, blurry, but damning. Mark remembered the incident. He'd been there. Delaney had gone off quick to rage. Mark hadn't said anything at the time. None of them had. Just another bad day. Just another suspect resisting. That had been the story, and everyone had stuck to it. His stomach churned. He had been complicit. He closed the folder and leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. For years he had prided himself on being a good cop. But what did that even mean now? Protect and serve. Who? You can't fix what you won't face. Olivia's voice echoed in his mind. He pulled out his phone and stared at Delaney's contact. They hadn't talked much since the incident. Delaney had always been the kind of cop who treated the badge like armor, who laughed when people talked about reform like it was a punchline. Mark hesitated, thumb hovering over the screen, then set the phone down. Not yet. He wasn't ready for that fight, but he would be. Instead, he opened a notepad and began writing. Names, incidents, patterns he'd seen. He was building a map of the broken parts. If he wanted to make change, he needed to understand the whole picture. The next morning, Olivia met him in the precinct parking lot. She knew just by the look on his face. "You read it," she said. Mark nodded. "You okay?" He didn't answer right. Away. "I don't know what I am, angry, embarrassed, but mostly, I'm tired of pretending we're not a part of the problem." Olivia studied him for a moment. "Then maybe it's time we stop pretending." They walked into the building together, side by side, silent but steady. The eyes of the precinct were on them. Mark could feel it, the shift, the unease. People didn't know what to make of him anymore. But for once that didn't matter. They had a plan. Olivia had already begun pulling together a group, quietly, carefully, officers who were ready to talk, to question, to be better. It wasn't a revolution, not yet, but it was something. A pulse under the surface. They called it the watchtower. It wasn't official and it wasn't safe. There were still officers who believed any form of accountability was betrayal, and there were command staff who would bury any threat to the status quo the second they sniffed it out. But the watchtower was about watching the watchers, about protecting the community and each other from those who had forgotten what their badge was supposed to mean. That afternoon, they held their first meeting. 6 officers, 2 community advocates, 1 weary public defender who had seen too much, and Mark. He didn't speak much at first. He listened to stories of abuse, of fear, of people who tried to speak out and were crushed for it. But there was also hope. Real, raw, burning hope. When it was his turn, Mark stood slowly, heart thudding. "I used to think I was doing the right thing," he said. "But I let a lot of things slide. I watched things happen and told myself it wasn't my place to question it. I didn't want to be the guy who made waves." He looked around the room. "But now I think maybe we need more people making waves." There was a beat of silence, then a nod, then another, and then someone said quietly, "Damn right." That night, Mark drove home not with certainty, but with purpose, a purpose he hadn't felt in years. He wasn't sure where this would lead. He wasn't even sure if the watchtower would survive the month, but for the first time he felt like he wasn't trying to fix the system alone, and maybe that was enough, for now. The following week brought a strange stillness to the precinct, unnerving, like the eye of a storm. Conversations hushed when Mark walked by. Old friends suddenly forgot how to meet his gaze. The silence wasn't loud, but it was deliberate, calculated. They knew, or at least they suspected. Whispers about the watchtower, had started to slip through the cracks, spreading, like smoke through the ranks. Mark wasn't surprised. Movements like this didn't stay in the shadows for long, but he hadn't expected the fallout to come so quickly or feel so personal. He was in the break room, pouring himself a coffee, when Sergeant Curtis, an old-school, hardline cop with 3 decades on the force, walked in. His stare was ice-cold. "You playing politics now, O'Connor?" Curtis said, grabbing a mug but not pouring. "Or is this just your little redemption tour?" Mark stiffened but kept his voice calm. "I'm just doing the job, maybe a little better than I used to." Curtis laughed, low and bitter. "You think this city wants a better cop? They want control. Son, they want to feel safe, not second-guess you every time you hesitate." Mark turned to face him fully. "Safe for who exactly?" That hung in the air for a long, taut moment. Curtis's smirk faded. "So you keep poking around, you're going to get yourself burned. Maybe not today, maybe not even here. But this department has a long memory and a short temper." Mark didn't flinch. "I'll take my chances." Curtis shook his head slowly. "Then I hope you've got backup, kid. Because the people you're protecting now, they're not going to be the ones testifying for you when it all hits the fan." Mark watched as Curtis left without another word, leaving a trail of tension behind him, like a snake slithering through the room. Back in his car, Mark sat in the silence. Curtis wasn't wrong, not entirely. The risks were real. There were consequences, coming, and not just for him. Olivia, the others from the watchtower, they'd all be targets if things escalated. But what were they supposed to do? Wait for permission? He picked up his phone and sent a quick text to Olivia. "We need to meet. Now." They met in a dimly lit back room of a community center on the west side, far from the precinct's usual patrol radius. Olivia was already there, along with 2 others from the watchtower, Danielle, a soft-spoken officer from Internal Affairs, and Luis, a former Marine-turned-patrolman who had a temper but a good heart. "You heard?" Olivia asked as soon as Mark walked in. "Yeah, Curtis came at me today. It's not just rumors anymore. They know something's up." Danielle leaned forward, her voice low. "I think they're watching my activity, my login. I tried accessing some older case files yesterday and got flagged. I've never had that happen before." Luis frowned. "This is going to get worse before it gets better. We all knew that, right?" Mark nodded. "We knew. But now we need to be ready." Olivia stood, grabbing a marker and moving to a whiteboard in the corner of the room. She wrote 3 words in big block letters: truth, strategy, shield. "We can't go public," she said, turning to the group. "Not yet, but we need a plan. If we're going to challenge this system, we need to build pressure safely. That means protecting each other, protecting the community, and protecting the truth." She pointed to each word as she spoke. "Truth is the files, the evidence, the stories that have been buried for years. We keep collecting them, documenting everything, backing it all up. No loose ends. Strategy means coordination. We work smart, not loud. Quiet wins first, reforms from the inside, quiet conversations with leadership we can trust, and slow leaks to the press only when we control the narrative. Shield is each other. If one of us gets suspended, demoted, investigated, we don't let them get isolated. We fight for them. We have each other's backs. That's how they always win. Divide and intimidate. We don't let that happen." Mark felt a surge of energy, a clarity he hadn't felt in weeks. This was real now, more than ideas, more than good intentions. This was action, strategy. "Let's go after the Delaney case," Mark said. "There's still a survivor, the guy he put in the hospital. He's alive. Let's find him." His voice could make all the difference. Olivia raised an eyebrow. "You sure? That case is old. You think he'll want to talk?" Mark nodded. "I think if we show him this isn't just about revenge, but real change, he might." Luis leaned back, arms crossed. "All right, then let's do it, but we move as one. No one goes rogue. We don't give them an excuse to shut this down." Danielle reached into her bag and pulled out a second folder, thinner than the others but labeled with a red tab. She slid it across the table to Mark. "This is what I could pull without raising alarms. It's not much, but it's a start." He opened it. Photos, names, dates, quiet cries for help from people the system had ignored. He took a deep breath. "We start here." That night, as he drove home, Mark couldn't help but notice how different the city looked again. Still broken, still tense, but alive too. And for the first time, it wasn't just the darkness he saw, it was the sparks. Tiny, defiant, impossible to ignore sparks. They were starting something bigger than themselves. It wouldn't be easy, but it would be worth it. The name was buried in the report: Jamal Tyson, 27 years old at the time of the incident. Arrested for loitering outside a gas station, no weapon, no threat. But somehow, the confrontation had ended with broken ribs, a concussion, and 3 nights in the ICU. Delaney's name had been scrubbed from the public version of the report. The bodycam footage never made it past the internal servers. The narrative had been rewritten like so many others. Suspect became combative, necessary force applied, case closed. But now, Mark was reopening it. He and Olivia sat in a borrowed, unmarked car across the street from a quiet apartment complex in Southside. The sun was just beginning to set, casting the buildings in orange and gold. According to Danielle, Jamal had moved twice since the incident and had recently started working nights at a logistics warehouse. Mark clutched the printout of the case file, the edges worn from his hands. "You think he's going to slam the door in our faces?" Olivia glanced at him, then back toward the building. "Maybe. But we're not here as cops today. We're here as people who owe him the truth. That matters." They crossed the street and climbed the narrow stairwell to apartment 3B. Mark knocked once, then again. Silence. Then the door opened just a crack. A man peeked out, his eyes cautious, tired. He looked older than the file photo, but still unmistakably the same Jamal. A scar ran just above his temple, a faint reminder of what Mark already knew had happened that night. "Jamal Tyson?" Mark asked gently. The man's eyes flicked too. The badge clipped to Mark's belt. He hadn't meant to leave it exposed. "No interviews, no surveys, I'm good." Jamal started to close the door. "We're not here for that," Olivia said quickly. "I'm Olivia Grant. This is Mark O'Connor. We're both officers, but we're not here in any official capacity. We're investigating misconduct. Your name came up, and we think you deserve to know why." Jamal hesitated. Mark added, "I was there that night. That stopped everything." Jamal's hand froze on the door. "You were one of the cops?" Mark nodded slowly. "I didn't stop it, but I should have." A long pause, tense, unreadable. Finally, the door opened wider. "Come in." The apartment was modest, clean, but clearly lived in. A couch with worn cushions, a chipped coffee table with unopened mail scattered on top. Jamal sat down across from them, arms folded, expression unreadable. "So, what now? You want to apologize? Try to make yourselves feel better?" he asked, his voice calm but razor-sharp. "No," Olivia said. "We want your help." Mark took a deep breath. "There's a movement, small, quiet, and dangerous for us, but we're trying to build something that holds people like Delaney accountable. Really accountable, not reassigned, not protected. We're trying to expose what's been hidden for years." "And you think I'm your poster boy?" Jamal asked, scoffing. "You think people care? I tried to get a lawyer back then. They told me the body cam was missing, that I was resisting. I lost everything, my job, my apartment, my trust." "We're not asking you to trust us," Mark said. "Not yet, but if you're willing, we want to make sure your story gets told. Properly. Truthfully." Jamal's expression tightened. "And what happens if I say no?" "Then we thank you for your time and we leave you alone," Olivia said, sincerity clear in her voice. For a moment no one spoke. Then Jamal stood and walked to the kitchen, pouring himself a glass of water. He leaned against the counter, staring out the window. "You know what hurts the most?" he said quietly. "It wasn't the beating. It was knowing that no one was going to believe me, that they'd see criminal record and decide I had it coming." Mark swallowed. "You didn't. You never did." Jamal turned. "Yeah? Then, why didn't you say something back then?" "I was afraid," Mark said honestly, "afraid of losing everything, and that fear made me a coward." There was another pause. Then Jamal gave the smallest nod. "All right. Let's talk." They stayed. For over an hour, Jamal told them everything he remembered, the shouting, the pain, the silence that followed. He'd never been the same after that night. Not physically, not emotionally. He carried that fear like a shadow, but now he was ready to talk, not for revenge, but for clarity, closure, and maybe, for change. They left the apartment with a recorded statement, his consent to share it within the movement, and a promise. If this went public, Jamal would be first to know. Back in the car, Olivia looked over at Mark. "You did good today. I still feel like I'm 90% guilt and 10% hope." Olivia chuckled. "That's more than most people have." Mark looked out at the city as night fell. This was only one story, but it was a start. A thread they could pull, and maybe if they pulled hard enough, the whole fabric would start to unravel. 2 days after meeting Jamal, the first crack in the armor appeared. Mark had just walked into the precinct when Danielle pulled him aside near the lockers. Her voice was low, urgent. "Someone leaked the Delaney file." He froze. "What?" "Parts of it. Just enough to make waves. The arrest report, the internal complaint summaries. It hit a blog that tracks police misconduct, small but loud." "It's spreading fast." Mark's heart sank. "We didn't authorize that." Danielle shook her head. "No one in the watchtower did. Someone's trying to beat us to the punch, and they're not doing it carefully." He pulled out his phone. Sure enough, there it was. A viral post titled, "This officer nearly killed a man, and the department promoted him." Below it, excerpts from the report. Redacted, but barely. Delaney's name was implied. The dates matched. The victim's initials were clearly Jamal's. Mark's stomach turned. He thought of Jamal's face. Reluctant, vulnerable, trusting. They'd promised to handle this the right way, quietly, safely. And now someone had thrown gasoline on the fire. "Does Olivia know?" he asked. "She's already at the community center," Danielle replied. "We're meeting now." The room was tense when he arrived. Luis paced by the window, muttering curses under his breath. Olivia stood by the whiteboard, her arms crossed, jaw clenched. "This wasn't us," she said as soon as Mark stepped in. "I know," he said, "but now it's out. What do we do?" Luis turned sharply. "You know what's going to happen. Now, IA is going to open a leak investigation. They'll use it to dig into us. Doesn't matter if it wasn't one of us. They'll make it our fault." Danielle nodded grimly. "They already pulled my network access. I'm on administrative pause." Mark's blood ran cold. It had begun. Olivia picked up a marker and tapped it against the board. "Okay, we don't panic. We pivot." She turned and wrote one word: leverage. "We didn't choose this timeline, but we can still use it. The story's out there. That means people are watching. If we act fast, we control the response. If we hesitate, we let the department bury it under noise." Mark looked at the headlines again on his phone. The story was gaining traction. Journalists were sniffing. Activists were tweeting. And somewhere out there, Delaney was definitely feeling the heat. "We need Jamal," he said. "He has to know. If he wants to come forward publicly, it has to be his choice." Olivia nodded. "You trust him?" "I think he wants truth more than revenge." She sighed. "Then go. Talk to him. See if he's willing to take the mic before someone else speaks for him." Mark found Jamal in the warehouse parking lot, just coming off a late shift. He looked tired but alert, already scrolling through his phone. "You seen it?" Mark asked. Jamal gave a short nod. "It's everywhere." "I swear, we didn't leak it," Mark said quickly. "We were going slow on purpose, to protect you." Jamal studied him for a long second. Then he shrugged. "Don't matter. The truth was gonna come out one way or another." "But how it comes out matters," Mark pressed. "Right now it's just noise. People are guessing, assuming. If you're ready, if you want to, we can get your story out clearly, in your own words, no spin, no edits." Jamal looked out over the parking lot. "I never wanted to be a headline man. I just wanted to live." "I know," Mark said quietly. "But maybe." Jamal sighed. "Maybe if I say something, someone else won't have to go through what I did." He paused, then nodded slowly. "All right, let's do it." By nightfall, a new post went live, this one on a respected platform, with Olivia's media contact helping craft the release. Jamal's full statement, A detailed timeline, screenshots, medical records, a powerful headline. I survived and I'm done being silent. It didn't take long for the story to go national. TV anchors were debating it. Podcasts were dissecting it. Protesters held up signs outside the department. We believe Jamal, justice, not just PR. And inside the precinct, Delaney was pulled from active duty. Not fired, not even suspended. Just quietly reassigned while an investigation began. Mark felt the familiar sting of disappointment, but he also felt something else. Pressure. Public pressure. And pressure, when applied right, could crack even the most immovable walls. Later that night, Mark stood outside the precinct with Olivia, both of them watching the crowd gather just across the street. Jamal stood with them, hands in his pockets, quiet but steady. You think this changes anything? Mark asked. Olivia gave a small smile. No, not yet. She looked up at the lit windows of the precinct. But it starts something. Mark nodded. Good. They stood there in silence, the chants from across the street rising and falling like waves. It wasn't the end of the story. It was the middle. And they weren't turning back now. The sound of sirens echoed through the streets like a constant reminder that the world outside the movement was still in chaos. Mark sat at his kitchen table, a cup of cold coffee in front of him, staring at the screen of his laptop. The story they had put out together, Jamal's statement, had taken off like wildfire. But with the spotlight came backlash, an even louder resistance. The department was scrambling, but more importantly, Delaney was still in the game. His reassignment was a temporary fix, a band-aid to stop the bleeding. But Mark knew it wouldn't last. They would either bury the story or throw him under the bus to keep everything else intact. Do you think it's enough? Olivia's voice cracked through the silence, her voice hoarse from a long day of calls. Mark turned around to face her, pushing the chair back. She stood in the doorway of his apartment, looking as worn as he felt. She'd been handling the media side of things while he focused on the investigation. They hadn't seen each other much in the last couple of days. It's never enough, Mark replied. This is just the start. Olivia nodded, stepping into the room and sitting down beside him. Jamal's statement got out, but do you think it'll be enough to actually change things? To expose all the corruption? Mark let out a long breath. Maybe, maybe not. But we've shaken something loose, and that's all we can do right now. Let the public decide. Olivia's eyes softened. You're doing the right thing. I keep thinking about the people who might get caught in the crossfire. They'll come after us. They'll come after anyone who stands with us. He glanced at her. I know. But I don't think there's any going back now. A knock at the door interrupted the conversation. Mark stood up immediately, a reflex from years of instinct. He moved cautiously toward the door, hand hovering near his service weapon. But it wasn't a threat. It was just Luis. Luis stepped inside, a brief look of concern on his face. You guys still working? Always, Mark replied, his voice dry. Luis handed him a manila folder, his gaze unwavering. I got this from a source in IA. Looks like they're starting a full investigation into you, Mark. Mark's stomach dropped as he opened the folder. There it was, the familiar logo of Internal Affairs stamped at the top of the page. It contained summaries of meetings and statements, all gathering evidence for the investigation. They were coming after him now. He wasn't just a part of the problem anymore, he was the problem. Olivia grabbed the folder from his hands, scanning the documents quickly. They can't do this. You're just doing your job, trying to expose the truth. Luis shot them both a dark look. They don't care about the truth, they care about saving face. They'll dig through every corner of your life, Mark, trying to find something to ruin you with. And they'll try to get to Olivia and the others too. Mark rubbed his temples. He could feel the weight of it all crushing down on him. Leaks, the false stories, the mounting pressure from every side. I don't care what they dig up, I'm not stopping. Luis set his jaw. Just don't get reckless. This is bigger than us now. The following days were a blur of tense meetings, closed-door discussions and ominous warnings. Every step forward felt like 2 steps back. The department was suffocating in the weight of the scandal, and every officer who had once been an ally seemed to retreat into the shadows, unwilling to take a side. Mark could feel the change in the precinct. The whispers had gotten louder. The glances more pointed, the subtle hostility undeniable. The calls from the press didn't stop either. Journalists wanted statements. They wanted Mark and Olivia on camera. They wanted the gritty details, the blood and the bruises of the story. But Mark knew better. Giving in to the media was another way of losing control. They couldn't afford to lose control. The breaking point came one night, when Mark was called to the scene of an officer-involved shooting. The report was vague, but the details were unmistakable. A civilian had been gunned down by another cop during a traffic stop gone wrong. Mark knew this wasn't coincidence. It wasn't even negligence. This was planned chaos, the kind of move that people like Delaney were good at. They were creating confusion, panic, and fear, hoping it would drown out the truth of Jamal's story. But this time, it wasn't going to work. He and Olivia raced to the scene, arriving to find the area cordoned off, yellow tape snaking around the crime scene. Uniformed officers were everywhere, their faces cold and distant. No one was talking, not even to the press. It was clear that someone was trying to sweep this under the rug, fast. "We need to see the body cam footage," Mark said to the officer. In charge, a young man named Carter who was visibly nervous. I don't think that's possible, sir," Carter replied, his eyes darting to his superior officer who stood across the lot, watching them. Mark felt the hair on the back of his neck stand up. "Why not?" The officer hesitated, clearly caught, in the middle of something much larger than himself. Orders came down from above. It's being handled internally. That was all Mark needed to hear. He turned to Olivia, his jaw set in determination. "We're getting that footage." She nodded. "How do we do this?" "We don't wait. We go to IA. We go straight to the top." The walk into IA's office was like walking into a lion's den. Mark could feel the eyes on him before he even stepped inside. The air was thick with tension. Everyone in the room knew why he was there, and no one was happy about it. Danielle was waiting for them. She met their gaze, her face grim. "You can't keep pushing like this, Mark. This is bigger than you think. IA is going to retaliate. They'll bury this case, and they'll bury you with it." "I'm not backing down," Mark replied. "We've seen this before, cover-ups. And if we don't do something now, the next person on the other side of this mess will be one of us." Danielle handed him a USB drive. "Here's the footage. It's not pretty, but it's the truth." Mark took it, the weight of it almost too much to bear. This was the breaking point, the moment that everything either fell apart or fell into place. Back at the apartment, Mark and Olivia watched the footage together. It was damning. The officer had shot the civilian without warning. No attempt to de-escalate, no sign of threat, just the cold, calculated pull of the trigger. Olivia clenched her fists. "We have to go public with this. If we don't, they'll bury it," Mark finished her sentence. "I know, but this is bigger than just us. It's bigger than one cop. This is systemic." He took a deep breath, looking over at her. "Are you with me?" Olivia didn't hesitate. "Always." The next morning, they uploaded the footage. It wasn't polished. It wasn't edited. It was raw, real, and uncensored. And it wasn't just a video. It was a message. They weren't going anywhere. And neither was the truth. The video had only been online for a few hours, but already it was everywhere. The footage had gone viral in the blink of an eye. The public was enraged, and the story was trending across all platforms. It wasn't just a local issue anymore. It was national, maybe even global. Every media outlet had picked up on it, and with each passing hour, the pressure on the department mounted. Mark sat in his car outside the precinct, hands gripping the steering wheel. His mind was spinning, his heart pounding in his chest. He'd been a cop long enough to know that the first wave of public outrage was only the beginning. What came next was far more dangerous. Inside, he could feel the tension rising. He had just seen Olivia storm into the building, her expression a mix of determination and fear. She wasn't going to back down, and neither was he. The doors to the precinct opened, and a handful of uniformed officers stepped out, their faces grim. Among them was Captain Harris, the highest-ranking officer in the department, and from the look on his face, Mark knew something big was about to happen. Captain Harris spotted him immediately and walked over, his expression cold. "We need to talk." Mark stepped out of the car, meeting Harris's gaze. About what? You know exactly what this is about, Harris said, voice low. The video, the leaks, the public fallout. It's all over the news, and the chief is furious. Do you have any idea what you've done? Mark's pulse quickened, but he stood his ground. I've done what's right. You can't sweep this under the rug anymore, Harris. The people deserve to know the truth. The captain's eyes narrowed. And what about the department? What about us? Do you really think airing all this out in public is going to fix anything? This is going to destroy us. Mark felt the weight of Harris's words, but he didn't back down. It's already broken, Captain. It's been broken for years. The only way to fix it is to expose the truth. Harris gritted his teeth. You have no idea what you're dealing with. If the higher-ups decide to make you the scapegoat for all of this, there's nothing I can do to protect you. Mark felt a cold chill settle in his stomach. He'd known this was coming, but hearing it from Harris made it all too real. The department wasn't going to let him walk away from this unscathed. They would come for him, and they would come hard. I'm not backing down, Mark said firmly, his voice steady despite the fear creeping up his spine. If you want to throw me under the bus, you can, but the truth is coming out, whether you like it or not. Harris studied him for a long moment, then turned and walked away without saying another word. Mark stayed where he was, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. He knew the fight was just beginning, but now, more than ever, he wasn't sure who he could trust. Inside the precinct, the atmosphere was tense. Every officer walked with purpose, their heads down, their movements swift and deliberate. No one was speaking to one another, and the air was thick with unspoken accusations. Everyone knew that things were going to change. The question was how much they would change, and who would be left standing when it was over. Mark made his way to his desk, the steady hum of the precinct's fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. Danielle was already there, staring at her computer screen, her fingers frozen on the keyboard. She looked up as he approached. Have you seen it? She asked, her voice low. Mark nodded grimly. It's everywhere. And the chief's office is demanding answers, Danielle said, shaking her head. They're already drafting a statement. They're going to try to control the narrative. So of course they are, Mark muttered, running a hand through his hair. They always do. I'm not sure how much longer we can keep doing this, Mark, Danielle said quietly. The pressure's building, and the higher-ups aren't exactly on our side. I know, he replied, but we have to keep pushing. We can't let them bury this. As if on cue, Olivia appeared in the doorway, her face a mixture of determination and exhaustion. She stepped into the room, closing the door behind her. The chief wants to see us. Mark's stomach sank. He knew what was coming. The chief wasn't going to be pleased, and with the department under fire, he wasn't sure if he could count on her to have his back. I'll be right behind you, Mark said to Olivia, watching her leave. The chief's office was everything Mark had expected, cold, sterile, and full of authority. Chief Turner sat behind her desk, her expression hard as stone. The door clicked shut behind him, and he could feel the weight of her gaze on him before he even spoke. Sit down, Officer Bradshaw, Chief Turner said, her voice clipped. Mark took a seat in front of her desk, trying to keep his posture straight, despite the nerves gnawing at his insides. I want to know what the hell happened. Bradshaw, Turner said, her voice low but controlled. Why is this going public? Why are you putting the department through this? Mark took a breath, choosing his words carefully. Because it's the truth, Chief, and the truth matters more than anything else. Truth, she scoffed, crossing her arms. You think this is just about the truth? The department is in chaos right now. We're being investigated and you think you're doing the right thing? You're destroying this place, officer. Do you realize that? I'm not the one who destroyed it, Mark replied, his voice firm, but I'm willing to fight to fix it. Chief Turner's eyes narrowed. And how do you plan to fix it? Huh? By making us the villain in front of the entire world? No, Mark said. By making sure this never happens again. By standing up for the people we're supposed to protect. By holding the system accountable. The chief's silence was deafening, but Mark held his ground. Finally, Chief Turner leaned back in her chair, her fingers tapping against the desk. You're walking a fine line, Bradshaw. You need to think about where this is going, and you need to make a choice. Is this really what you want to fight for? Mark's mind raced, the weight of her words sinking in. She wasn't asking if he could handle the fight. She was asking if he was willing to sacrifice everything for it. "I've already made my choice," he said quietly, "and I'm not turning back." The following days were a blur of press conferences, protests, and mounting tension within the department. The video had done what Mark had hoped. It had ignited a firestorm of public outrage, but it also brought the full weight of retaliation down on him. Internal affairs was circling, the media was relentless, and every corner of the department felt like it was closing in. The precinct had become a battlefield, not between criminals and cops, but between cops who were determined to protect their own, and those who believed in exposing the truth at any cost. Mark felt the strain in every exchange, every whispered conversation that stopped when he entered the room. The hardest part wasn't the external pressure, though. It was the feeling of betrayal. Officers who used to back him, who used to be his brothers and sisters in arms, were now avoiding his gaze. Their loyalty torn between duty to the badge and duty to themselves. They were all scrambling, trying to survive the storm, and in the process Mark was left standing alone, holding the truth like a shield. That morning, Mark walked into the precinct, to the hum of frantic activity. Officers were glued to their desks, working overtime on paperwork, and the phone lines never stopped ringing. But even with all the noise around him, the tension was suffocating. People were whispering, but no one was talking to him. Not openly, anyway. As Mark sat down at his desk, he caught sight of Olivia standing across the room, her brow furrowed as she stared at her phone. Her face looked drawn, as if the weight of everything was starting to wear on her. He stood up, walking over to her. "What's going on?" She looked up at him, her eyes tired but determined. "It's getting worse. Internal Affairs is talking about suspension, possible criminal charges. The media's already calling for your resignation. People are turning on you, Mark." "I know," Mark replied, his voice low. "But we can't back down now. We've already exposed too much." Olivia's eyes softened with concern. "But what's the end game here? We're both on the verge of losing everything. The department, our jobs, our reputation, it's all slipping away." Mark clenched his jaw, trying to ignore the doubt creeping into his mind. He knew that she was right. He was teetering on the edge. One wrong move, and it would all come crashing down. "I don't know what the end game is yet," he admitted. "But I can't stop now. We've got too many people depending on us to stop." Olivia bit her lip, nodding slowly. "Then let's keep pushing. I'm with you." Just then, the door to the precinct swung open, and Lieutenant Daniels walked in, flanked by two internal affairs agents. His face was as cold as ever, but there was something about the way he held himself, like he had already made up his mind about something, and it wasn't good. Mark's heart sank. He knew what was coming. "Bradshaw," Daniels said, his voice sharp, "we need to talk." They walked into a small conference room, away from the prying eyes of the rest of the precinct. The door clicked shut behind them, and Mark stood there, bracing himself for whatever was about to come. Daniels looked at him with a combination of frustration and disappointment. "I don't know what the hell you think you're doing, but this ends now." Mark crossed his arms, refusing to show fear. "It ends when the truth comes out, not before." Lieutenant Daniels shook his head, pacing back and forth. "You're destroying this department, Bradshaw. You've put us all at risk. You're not just jeopardizing your career, you're jeopardizing all of us. The chief wants your badge. She wants you out, and Internal Affairs, they're already looking for any excuse to take you down." "And you think I'm just going to walk away?" Mark said, his voice rising. "I'm doing what I should have done a long time ago. I'm trying to fix this." Daniel's face twisted in frustration. "By making us the scapegoat? By airing our dirty laundry to the whole world? You've lost sight of everything. You've lost sight of what this department stands for." Mark didn't flinch. "No, Lieutenant, I haven't lost sight of what this department stands for. What I've lost sight of is letting people like Delaney walk away with their hands clean, while people like Jamal get buried. I'm not backing down from this fight. Not now, not ever." The silence in the room was heavy. Daniels stood there staring at him, weighing his words. Finally, he sighed, rubbing his temples. "You've already made your choice," Daniels said quietly. "But don't expect anyone to back you up on this. You're on your own." As Mark walked out of the conference room, he could feel the walls closing in. The weight of Daniels' words hung over him like a cloud. He wasn't just fighting a broken system, he was fighting the very people he had once called colleagues, and he wasn't sure how much longer he could keep going. "Olivia," met him by the door, her expression guarded. "What happened?" "They're coming for me," Mark said, his voice low. "They've already made up their minds. It's just a matter of time before they make the move." Olivia nodded, her eyes filled with sympathy. "Then we keep fighting. We don't let them win." Mark smiled at her, the first real smile he'd had in days. It was small, but it was something. "Yeah, we don't let them win." That afternoon, Mark made a decision. He wasn't going to wait for the department to destroy him. He was going to take the fight to them on his terms. He called a meeting with the press. The following day, Mark stood at the front of a crowded room, facing a sea of cameras. The room was buzzing with questions, and the tension was palpable. It had been a long time since anyone had called for a press conference, especially with the department in crisis. But Mark wasn't here to hide behind official statements. He wasn't here to protect the department. He was here to speak the truth. "I'm here today because the people of this city deserve the truth," he said, his voice clear and unwavering. "And I'm here because the system that's supposed to protect them has failed. I've seen it firsthand. I've watched as corruption, racism, and negligence tore apart everything I believed in, and I can't stand by and let it continue." The room fell silent, everyone waiting for his next words. "I know this isn't going to be easy," Mark continued, "but I'm willing to lose everything, my badge, my career, my reputation, if it means exposing the truth. This isn't just about one bad cop. This is about a system that has allowed it to go on for far too long." The press room erupted in chaos. Reporters shouted questions, cameras flashed, and the air was thick with excitement. But amidst the noise, Mark knew something had shifted. This wasn't just a fight for his future. It was a fight for everyone who had ever been failed by the system. And no matter what happened next, he wasn't going to stop until the truth was heard. The press conference had shaken things up in ways that Mark hadn't anticipated. He had known that speaking out would stir the pot, but he didn't expect the storm it unleashed. The truth had a way of spreading faster than fire, and the ripple effect was already taking shape. In just a few hours, social media was ablaze with support, and the hashtag #DarksTruthOver badge began trending across the country. But there was another side to the equation, the darker side. While many supported him, there were just as many, if not more, who called him a traitor, a threat to the stability of law enforcement. Mark sat at his desk in the precinct the next morning, the familiar hum of the building surrounding him. His phone was buzzing constantly with messages and notifications, but he couldn't bring himself to look at them. The anxiety in his chest had reached new heights. He'd opened a floodgate, and there was no telling how far the water would rise. At that moment, Olivia walked in. Her face was pale, but there was a determined fire in her eyes, the same fire that had never flickered since this all began. She didn't even need to say anything. The look on her face told Mark everything. "Toe?" he said quietly, not looking up from his phone. "It's getting worse, isn't it?" Olivia nodded, pulling up a chair beside him. "The press is calling for action. The department's already distancing themselves from you. They've made it clear they're not going to back you up." Mark exhaled slowly. He had known this was coming, but hearing it out loud made it feel all too real. "I knew it was a risk, but I couldn't keep quiet. It's too late now. The truth is out." Olivia hesitated before speaking again, her voice softer now. "You're going to need more than the truth to survive this. If you don't have the department behind you, you're going to be fighting alone. They're already talking about disciplinary action." Mark met her gaze, his eyes burning with the kind of intensity that only comes from the need to see something through, no matter the cost. "I didn't ask for this fight, but now that I'm in it, I'm not going to back down." Later that afternoon, Mark found himself face to face with internal affairs again. This time the room was even colder than before, the stakes higher. Lieutenant Daniels was already there, his arms crossed, his jaw tight. Sitting beside him were two other internal affairs officers, their expressions unreadable. Mark felt the weight of their gazes on him as he sat down. No one spoke for a few moments, the tension thick in the air. Finally, Daniels cleared his throat. "Bradshaw, let's not waste time. We've reviewed the footage, we've heard your statement, and now we need to hear your side of the story." Mark straightened in his chair, leaning forward slightly. "You've already seen the video. What more is there to say?" Your actions were reckless, one of the internal affairs officers said, his voice clipped. So you've put this department in jeopardy. You've made accusations without evidence, and now the public is demanding answers. This isn't just about you anymore, Bradshaw. It's about the integrity of the entire police force. Mark's fists clenched under the table. He knew they weren't going to make this easy. They were going to try to bury him under the weight of their words, to discredit everything he had done. I didn't make any accusations, Mark said, keeping his voice steady. I exposed the truth. You can call it reckless if you want, but that doesn't change what's happening. The public deserves to know the officers who have been complicit in this need to be held accountable. Daniels shot him a hard look. You're talking like you've got a crusade to win. You're making this personal. You've crossed a line, Bradshaw. Mark took a deep breath, his mind racing. What line? The one where we protect each other even when it's wrong? The one where we stay silent because it's easier than admitting the truth? I'm not crossing any line. I'm just standing up for what's right. For a moment, the room was silent. Mark could see that his words were starting to sink in, especially for the other officers in the room. He wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. He was fighting for everyone who had stayed silent too long. He could feel the weight of it in his bones, the importance of this moment. Daniels broke the silence with a sigh. I've got nothing more to say to you. You've made your bed, Bradshaw. Now you'll have to lie in it. The words stung. But Mark didn't flinch. He'd known this was coming. As he walked out of the room, Mark's thoughts were a whirlwind. His mind was reeling from the conversation with internal affairs, but there was something else tugging at the back of his mind, something deeper. He'd exposed corruption, yes, but what had he really achieved? Was the truth enough? Would he be able to keep fighting, or was this the beginning of the end? He walked back to his desk, trying to push the doubts aside. He had made his decision, and there was no turning back. But the weight of the unknown was pressing down on him harder than ever. Olivia was already sitting at her desk when he returned, her eyes glued to her screen, but she looked up when he approached. How did it go? She asked, her voice soft but laced with concern. Mark took a deep breath and dropped into his chair. Not good. They're going to try to make me the scapegoat. Internal affairs is on the warpath, and the department's already cutting ties. It feels like everything's falling apart. Olivia nodded, her expression grim. But you won't back down, right? No, Mark replied without hesitation. I can't back down now. Not after everything we've uncovered. Not after everything that's happened. Olivia reached out and placed a hand on his arm, offering a small smile of support. Then we keep pushing, no matter what comes next. The next few days were a blur of media appearances, protests, and silent whispers in the halls of the precinct. The public support continued to grow, but so did the pressure. Mark was more isolated than ever. Officers were distancing themselves from him, afraid that being associated with him would jeopardize their own careers. But it didn't matter. Mark wasn't looking for validation from the people who had been silent for too long. He was looking for justice, and he was willing to sacrifice everything to see it done. One evening, as he sat alone in his car, staring out at the city lights, he received a call. The voice on the other end was familiar. It was Olivia. "We need to meet," she said urgently. "There's something you need to see." When Mark arrived at the small diner where Olivia had asked to meet, she was already there, waiting. Her face was tense and her eyes were hard. She didn't waste time with pleasantries. "I've been digging," she said, sliding a manila folder across the table to him, "and I found something big." Mark raised an eyebrow, his heart rate picking up. "What is it?" Olivia leaned in closer, lowering her voice. "It's about Delaney. There's more to this story than you think, and this time we've got the evidence to back it up." Mark's eyes widened as he opened the folder. Inside were photographs, documents, and an address. Delaney's involvement went deeper than they had ever imagined. This was it, the break they had been waiting for. "Let's bring him down," Mark said, a new sense of resolve filling him for the EC. First time in days, he felt something that had been missing, a spark of hope. The file Olivia handed him was more than just a collection of documents. It was the key to exposing everything, the corruption, the cover-ups, and the officers who had allowed it to fester in the shadows. Mark felt a sense of urgency settle in his chest. Delaney was no longer just a name, he was a target. And now, with this evidence, they had a chance to bring him down. Mark didn't waste any time. He immediately started making plans. This was the breakthrough they'd been waiting for, the one that could potentially shift the balance. He knew they had to act fast before Delaney, or anyone else involved, had the chance to cover their tracks. Olivia, always by his side, was already a step ahead. "I've contacted a few people I trust on the inside," she said, her voice steady as they sat in a quiet corner of the diner. "We've got the documents, but we need more than just that. We need to make sure it's airtight. Something they can't dismiss. I think we should take it straight to the press." Mark paused, considering the weight of that decision. "If we go public, it'll make everything worse. Internal Affairs is already gunning for me. If we go out with this, there's no turning back." Olivia's gaze was unwavering. "That's exactly why we need to do it. They want to silence you, Mark. If we wait too long, Delaney and his people will find a way to bury this like everything else. We need to put the pressure on them, force their hand." Mark ran a hand through his hair, the reality of their situation sinking in. Olivia was right. They couldn't afford to wait any longer. They had the chance to expose Delaney and the system that protected him. They had to do it now. But Mark couldn't shake the feeling that once they made the move, there would be no going back. The next day, Mark and Olivia sat down in a small, nondescript office with a journalist who had been following the story from the beginning. Julia Stevens was known for her investigative work, and while she had covered the department's issues in the past, this was something entirely different. The files they had were explosive. Julia wasted no time flipping through the documents, her face growing grimmer with each page. This is a game changer," she said, her voice low. "I can't believe this is all here, right under our noses." "Can you use it?" Mark asked, his voice filled with equal parts hope and trepidation. Julia looked up, her expression unreadable for a moment before she nodded. "I can do more than use it. I can make sure this gets out to the public, to the people who need to see it. But I'll need your permission to run with it. Once it's out there, there's no turning back." Mark met her gaze. He knew the risks, but at this point, he didn't have a choice. "Do it," he said, his voice firm. "We're all in. This ends today." Later that evening, the story broke. Mark watched as the press conference was broadcast live on every major news outlet. The documents they had uncovered were out in the open, and the details were as damning as Mark had hoped. Delaney's name was mentioned repeatedly, tied to a series of illegal activities, bribes, and shady deals. The web of corruption was far wider than anyone had realized, and Delaney was right at the center of it all. As the news spread, the public reaction was swift. People were enraged. Protests erupted outside police stations, calling for justice. The department was in turmoil, with many officers either going into hiding or scrambling to cover their tracks. But the truth was out now, and there was no undoing it. Mark and Olivia watched the coverage from Mark's apartment, the weight of the moment hanging over them. It was a victory, but it felt bittersweet. The department was unraveling. The justice they had been fighting for was within reach, but at a great personal cost. Mark leaned back on the couch, his eyes staring at the screen, watching the chaos unfold. He felt exhausted, the adrenaline that had been pushing him forward slowly draining away. The fight wasn't over yet, but this was a turning point. "What now?" Olivia asked, her voice cutting through the silence. Mark looked at her, a flicker of determination crossing his face. "Now we take down Delaney." The next few days were a whirlwind. The public outcry was relentless, and pressure was mounting on the department to take immediate action. Internal Affairs was still circling, but now they had no choice but to start investigating Delaney more seriously. Officers who had once been loyal to him were now being forced to make tough decisions, some of them even reaching out to Mark, offering information or insight into what had really been happening behind closed doors. But it wasn't enough. Not yet. Mark knew that Delaney wouldn't go down easily. The man had too much power, too many connections. He would fight back, and Mark was prepared for whatever came next. He couldn't afford to make a mistake. If they wanted to bring Delaney down for good, they had to be smart, strategic. Every move had to count. It was then that Olivia received a call that would change everything. That evening, as Mark and Olivia were going over the next steps, Olivia's phone rang. She looked at the caller ID and answered quickly, her voice urgent. As she listened, Mark could see the color drain from her face as the conversation unfolded. "What is it?" he asked, his heart racing. Olivia hung up the phone and looked at him, her expression grave. "It's Delaney. He's not just hiding anymore. He's on the move. He's got a plan, Mark, and we need to stop him before it's too late." Mark's blood ran cold. "What are we talking about? What's he planning?" Olivia's face twisted with a mix of fear and determination. "We don't know yet, but he's got allies, and they're already in position. He's making his next move. Right now. If we don't act fast, everything we've worked for could be destroyed." Mark didn't hesitate. The stakes were higher than ever. "Then we go after him now." The hunt for Delaney was on, and Mark knew that the final showdown was fast approaching. The battle for justice had reached its climax. They were no longer just fighting for the truth. They were fighting for their lives. The storm was coming and they had to be ready. The only question left was, would they be able to take down Delaney before it was too late? The city buzzed with tension. Protesters gathered outside precincts demanding accountability, while others rallied in defense of the police force, citing the dangers of betrayal within the ranks. Social media feeds were flooded with hashtags, opinion pieces, and calls for justice. Everyone had an opinion, but very few had the facts. The reality, however, was that Mark's mission was far from over. He had exposed the truth, but exposing corruption was only the beginning. Now he had to deal with the fallout, the most dangerous part of the battle. Mark sat in his apartment, staring at the pile of documents and photos scattered on the coffee table before him. The adrenaline that had fueled him for days was beginning to wear thin. His mind raced through the next steps, but the constant anxiety was gnawing at him. Delaney had always been one step ahead, and Mark knew the man wouldn't go down quietly. With every passing hour, the danger increased. The pressure was mounting, and Mark couldn't shake the feeling that something was closing in on him. Olivia had been on edge too, running back and forth between meetings, making calls and coordinating with people on the inside. But even she seemed to be growing weary. Every time she looked at Mark, he could see the concern in her eyes. They were in the eye of the storm now, and there was no way to predict how it would end. "How long do we have?" Mark asked, breaking the silence. Olivia looked at him, her brow furrowed in thought. "It's hard to say. Delaney's moving fast. We've got people on the inside trying to track his movements, but he's playing his cards close. If we're lucky, we'll catch him before he makes his next move." "But luck's not a strategy," Mark muttered, rubbing his eyes. The sleepless nights were starting to catch up with him. He hadn't had a full night's rest in days, and the exhaustion was starting to seep into his bones. "No, it's not," Olivia agreed. "But it's the best we've got. We need to move quickly." "He's making a move tonight, Mark. I'm sure of it." Mark stood up, his mind snapping into focus. "All right, let's gear up. We can't afford to wait. We go after him now." Olivia nodded, her resolve hardening. She quickly grabbed her jacket, then looked back at Mark. "You're sure about this?" Mark took a deep breath, his eyes meeting hers. "We've already come this far. There's no turning back. This ends tonight." The streets were quieter than usual as Mark and Olivia made their way through the city in their unmarked car. The air was thick with the promise of something imminent, and every shadow seemed to hold a hidden threat. The wind whipped through the alleys, carrying with it the sound of distant sirens and muffled voices. It was as if the city itself was holding its breath, waiting for what would happen next. Olivia checked her phone for the last time. "He's at an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town," she said, her voice clipped with urgency. "We need to be quick. No backup, just us. We can't afford to alert him." Mark nodded, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. He could feel the adrenaline coursing through his veins again, a rush of energy that drowned out the fatigue. He'd been here before, hunting down the corrupt, risking everything to get justice. But this felt different. This wasn't just about a case anymore. It wasn't just about Delaney or the department, it was about his life. It was about survival. As they approached the warehouse, Mark slowed the car and parked a few blocks away. They didn't need to draw attention to themselves. They'd have to make their way in on foot, with nothing more than the knowledge of the building's layout and their instincts to guide them. "Stay sharp," Mark whispered as they exited the car, checking his gun for the third time. "This could get ugly fast," Olivia nodded. "Just like old times." Mark didn't respond. There was nothing to say. They had both been through this before, and they knew how it went. It was never easy, and it was rarely clean, but tonight it had to end. They approached the warehouse, crouching low behind a stack of crates. The area was eerily silent, but Mark could sense the tension building. He could feel the weight of the moment, the ticking clock in his head. Time was running out. He motioned for Olivia to follow him as they moved closer to the entrance, staying out of sight as much as possible. Mark signaled for Olivia to take the left side, and he went right. They would flank the building, meet in the middle, and sweep it. It was the best chance they had. They crept through the shadows, the only sound their steady breaths and the crunch of gravel beneath their feet. The building loomed ahead, its dilapidated, walls hiding the secrets it contained. Mark's mind raced, running through the possibilities. This was it, the moment that would either bring him peace or tear his life apart. Suddenly a faint sound, footsteps. Mark froze, his heart pounding in his chest. He signaled for Olivia to halt. The sound was getting closer. They weren't alone. Without warning, a group of armed men appeared from behind a stack of crates, their guns aimed straight at Mark and Olivia. Mark's body tensed, instinct taking over. He reached for his gun, but Olivia was quicker. With a sharp movement, she disarmed the closest man and knocked him out with a swift punch to the face. The other men hesitated for just a moment, and that was all Mark needed. He drew his weapon and took cover, firing a warning shot to disorient them. The fight was on. Gunfire rang out, echoing through the night. Mark and Olivia moved quickly, using their training to stay ahead of the attackers. They were outnumbered, but they had the element of surprise on their side. For every shot fired, Mark kept moving, his focus unshakable. Olivia was at his side, as always, watching his back. Together, they moved in sync, clearing rooms, taking down opponents always one step ahead. But as they reached the main room of the warehouse, something felt wrong. The air was thick with tension, and Mark's instinct screamed at him that they were walking into a trap. And then he saw him. Delaney. The man stood by a large steel door, flanked by two of his most loyal men. He was smiling, almost too calm. Mark's blood ran cold. "You're too late, Bradshaw," Delaney called out, his voice smooth, mocking. "You think you can take me down? You're nothing but a pawn in a game you can't possibly understand." Mark raised his gun, his finger tight on the trigger. But before he could speak, Delaney held up a hand, signaling for his men to lower their weapons. "I'm done running, Bradshaw," he said with a smirk, "but I'm not done winning." Mark's heart skipped a beat. This wasn't just a confrontation. This was the beginning of something far bigger. Delaney had one last trick up his sleeve, and it was going to change everything. The tension in the warehouse was suffocating, a silent standoff that held the weight of everything Mark had fought for. Delaney stood there, calm as ever, while Mark's pulse thundered in his ears. The gun in his hand felt heavy, the cold steel of it, a reminder of how far this fight had taken him. Olivia stood beside him, her eyes sharp, every muscle in her body coiled, ready for whatever came next. But the air felt thick with anticipation, and for the first time in this entire ordeal, Mark couldn't shake the feeling that Delaney had the upper hand. Mark's voice was steady, but there was an edge to it. "You're finished, Delaney. It's over. There's no way out of this." Delaney's smirk deepened, but his eyes were calculating, as though he were deciding how best to play his cards. "You think so? You're naive, Bradshaw. You have no idea what's really going on here." He looked at his men, then back at Mark, his grin widening. "I'm not just a cop. I'm more than that. I always have been." Mark's finger tightened around the trigger of his weapon, his gaze locked on Delaney, but his mind was racing. What was Delaney talking about? What was he hiding? Mark had thought the battle was simple, bring down a corrupt officer. But now, it felt like the tip of a much larger iceberg. Olivia moved slightly closer to Mark, her voice low. "We need to keep him talking, figure out what he's planning." Mark nodded imperceptibly. Delaney might think he was in control, but he wouldn't get away with this. "What do you mean?" Mark asked, his voice calm but probing. "What's really going on?" Delaney chuckled darkly, leaning back against the wall with an air of arrogance. "You think it's just about a few crooked cops? About me and a few bad apples in the department?" He shook his head, like he was explaining a simple truth to a child. "This is bigger than that. This is about power, real power, money, influence. You've been chasing shadows, Bradshaw, while I've been playing the game all along." Mark's mind raced. What was Delaney talking about? The corruption he had uncovered was massive, yes, but was it just the tip of the iceberg? "You're a pawn in a much larger scheme," Delaney continued, his tone cold and calculating. "You think you're doing the right thing by exposing me. You're not. You're just one part of the puzzle, and when it's all over, you'll be forgotten. You'll be nothing." Mark felt his jaw tighten. "I'm not in this for fame, Delaney. I'm in this to make sure people like you can't get away with it anymore." Delaney stepped forward, his eyes locking with Mark's. "You really think that exposing me will change anything? You think the system cares about justice? The system is mine. It always has been. And in the end, Bradshaw, you'll see that there's nothing you can do to stop it." Mark's heart raced, the pieces of the puzzle falling into place. Delaney wasn't just a corrupt cop. He was part of something much larger, something that had infiltrated the very heart of the city's power structure. He wasn't just after money or influence, he was after control. "We'll see about that," Mark said, his voice unwavering, even though his mind was reeling. He knew Delaney was dangerous. He'd known that from the start. But now it felt like they were standing at the edge of a much deeper abyss. Delaney's men shifted nervously behind him, their weapons still trained on Mark and Olivia. But Delaney raised a hand, signaling for them to lower their guns. The standoff wasn't over, but for now it seemed like Delaney was enjoying the game, savoring the tension. "You don't understand," Delaney said, his tone shifting. "This city, this department, the power behind it all, it's bigger than you. You're just a small part of the machine, and when it's all over, when I'm back in control, you'll be nothing but a footnote in history." Mark felt a surge of determination. He had heard this kind of talk before. Men like Delaney always thought they were untouchable, that they could never lose. But Mark had fought too hard to back down now. He had the evidence, he had the support, and he wasn't going to let this man destroy everything he had worked for. "We'll see who the footnotes are, Delaney," Mark said, his voice low but resolute. "You're not untouchable. This ends tonight." Olivia was already moving, her eyes scanning the room looking for any opening. Mark knew she was ready. They both were. This was it, the final showdown. Delaney had made his move, but now it was their turn to finish this. Suddenly, the door to the warehouse creaked open, and Mark's attention snapped to it. A figure emerged from the shadows, an officer, someone Mark recognized. It was Captain Peterson. "Mark, Olivia," Peterson said, his voice firm but urgent. "You need to get out of here, now." Mark's eyes narrowed. "What are you doing here, Peterson? Are you with him?" Peterson's face twisted in frustration. "No, I'm not with him. But if you don't leave now, Delaney's people will kill you both. They're everywhere. You're walking into a trap." Mark froze, his mind raced. Delaney's game was much bigger than he had realized. Peterson's warning was clear. If they didn't act quickly, they were both dead. "Get down!" Olivia shouted, shoving Mark to the floor just as gunfire erupted from the shadows. Chaos exploded around them, and everything seemed to happen in a blur. Bullets ricocheted off the concrete, and Mark scrambled to his feet, returning fire, his heart pounding in his chest. Olivia moved with deadly precision, her training taking over as she fired back, creating a path for Mark to advance. The chaos was deafening, but Mark's focus remained sharp. Delaney had underestimated them, and now it was time to make him pay. Mark pushed forward, using the smoke and confusion to his advantage. Delaney's men were distracted, trying to regroup, but Mark and Olivia were closing in. The truth was finally within reach. Mark and Olivia reached Delaney just as he attempted to make a run for it. But before he could escape, Mark tackled him to the ground, pinning him down. "This is over," Mark said, his voice calm, but his hands tight around Delaney's collar. Delaney glared up at him, the rage in his eyes burning brighter than ever. How you think this changes anything? He spat. You're just one man. The system will protect me. Mark's grip tightened. Not anymore. The system's been broken, and you're going down with it. With the sound of sirens approaching, Mark and Olivia knew the game was over. They had won. The next few weeks were a blur. Delaney was arrested, the full extent of his corruption exposed to the public. The city was shaken to its core, but there was hope. Real change was finally on the horizon. Mark's life was no longer in danger, but the cost of everything he had been through weighed heavily on him. As he sat in his apartment, reflecting on everything that had happened, Olivia sat across from him, her eyes soft with understanding. You did it, she said quietly. You brought him down. Mark looked out the window, his thoughts drifting. We did it. But it's not over. This is just the beginning. There's still so much work to be done. Olivia smiled faintly, standing up to join him at the window. And we'll do it together. Mark nodded, feeling a sense of peace that had eluded him for so long. They had fought for justice, and they had won. It was over. But it was also just the beginning. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough?